MCP, CBO, currently serves as Vice President of West Coast Code Consultants, Inc., and is a licensed structural engineer, civil engineer, and ICC Master Code professional. He is also certified by ICC as a building official, fire code official, combination plans examiner inspector, fire plans examiner inspector, and as an accessibility plans examiner inspector. With over 20 years of experience serving in the building, safety, fire prevention, and energy industries, he has performed detailed plan reviews for thousands of projects throughout Utah, Wyoming, Nevada, California, Washington, Texas, and Arizona. Chris has authored the 2018 International Existing Building Code Handbook, co-authored the 2018 International Building Code Handbook, and has numerous publications in trade journals and magazines. Mr. Kimball is considered an expert in various engineering disciplines and regularly shares his expertise educating industry peers as an approved ICC instructor. Just as a reminder, if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A box, and Chris can get to those during the presentation or afterwards. Okay, go ahead, Chris.
All right, thank you very much. Please let me know if you have any questions. I have the question and answer screen open, so I'll try to be following that as we move along here. Also, for those of you that have been on this all day,
Chris, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I will say that we can see your notes below your presentation. Can you make it full screen?
Let's see how. Let's see.
That's actually closed caption.
That's closed caption. So how do you turn that off? Is that this? There we go.
There we go.
Sorry. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I don't ever put notes down there, but anyhow, those of you that were on the call earlier today, and Todd was instructing on accessibility. I was there in the background trying to get a feel for how his presentation would go, and unfortunately, I thought I was just an attendee, and I had no idea, and I was not muted, and I was having a conversation with a coworker, and I sincerely apologize to all of you. Right after the presentation, Todd shared a cartoon with me. Today's cartoon from Dilbert was just that Dilbert was on a, he was on a virtual meeting. Somebody said that they had several more topics to discuss. Dilbert said all of this stuff thinking he was on mute. And then they told him that he should go on mute. And he said, and he apologized, and he said it was because of the TV in the background. But anyhow, I wish I could do that, but I apologize. I flustered Todd, and I interrupted that meeting. So I got a question already. Did I hire the intern or not? So hopefully they will find a good intern to hire. So we'll see. Hopefully you heard a lot more about accessibility than my conversation. So today's class, we have 2 hours. We only have 2 hours to talk about the International Existing Building Code. And while this code is not a very large code, there's a lot of stuff to it. There's a lot of things and nuances that we should be aware of. Usually I'll teach this as a full day course. I cut a lot of slides out, but at the same time, we have way too many slides to go over today. So there's going to be times that I will skip slides, but I'm giving you the handouts and presentations for hopefully to help you and give you some more background material. 2 hours to cover a code is just not enough time. One thing I will say is I love existing buildings. I love the opportunity to keep something that we've had for a long time, but also the opportunity we have to make it safe. And so as somebody that does plan reviews, that serves as a building official, I really take that responsibility of ensuring buildings are safe very, very highly. Is very important to me. And so I really like the IEBC. It provides a compromise to what we have for new construction and what we should be requiring for existing buildings. So today in this brief course that we have, the intent is really just to give us an introduction. What is the IEBC? Why do we have it? How is it laid out? You need to be able to know where to go in pretty quickly within it. There's several different paths that the IEBC lays out to you. So determine what path you're going to go to and make sure you stick to those chapters. You're not supposed to be mixing paths at all. We'll talk about that. And then we should, in our mind, we should keep in mind what are the mandatory triggers that come about. If I do this to an existing building, what now has it triggered that I have to do? Most of all of the triggers that we have within the IEBC, they're in relation to structural requirements. There's a lot into fire safety. That even includes means of egress, and a lot of accessibility triggers. And I know Todd earlier today talked about accessibility requirements for existing buildings. Okay, so we're going to go through 7 different topics if we have the opportunity to. We'll first do a brief introduction of the IEBC. Then we'll cover chapters 1 through 3, which are kind of the general chapters that are associated with all paths. Then we'll discuss the repair requirements of the code. We'll go into the prescriptive path, the work area path, and then the performance path that are outlined in the IEBC. And then we'll talk about relocated structures. And that'll give you a really good feel for what's going on in the IEBC. First of all, I have this picture. When you drive throughout the United States, you see a lot of older towns where the main street looks just like this. In general, these are not the ideal type of buildings that we would be building nowadays, right? Especially if you're in a high seismic region, where these are very heavy, brittle structures, right? If these are brick or unreinforced masonry construction, and now you have seismic ground motions, which are not going to react well to that. Or even in areas of high wind, when you have these tall brick parapets or things that might fall down on somebody in these heavy wind events. Same thing with chimneys. So we have throughout the US, we have a lot of existing buildings that are really neat. We like to see them, we like to look at them, but in truth, a lot of them are dangerous. How can we keep these, but also make sure that it's not going to be too exorbitant for the owner? Where can we find a middle ground for life safety? So that's the purpose of the IEBC. It's to encourage the reuse of these buildings and to find a reasonable way to upgrade or improve them to meet minimum life safety requirements. And now how you determine reasonable and how you define that is going to be different for everybody, but that's the intent of the IEBC. When you use the existing building code, you need to keep in mind these items. Anything new that you're doing within the building, that new work needs to conform to the current building code requirement, the IEBC. The IEBC is now a companion code to it. So it's actually referenced right away in chapter 1 of the IEBC as a companion code, just like the mechanical code and the plumbing code. It's supposed to go hand in hand with the building code. Again, all new work complies with the building code, and then any upgrades you need to follow the requirements within the IEBC. In general, anytime we're going to do repairs to a building, we're going to do alterations, additions. If it's a change of occupancy, those are the sorts of things that we should be turning to the IEBC right away rather than digging through the IEBC. They have specific provisions in there for historic buildings and moved structures, and depending upon which path you go, you might find benefits one way versus another. And I'll give you an example when we talk about historic buildings. And again, multiple paths for compliance. In general, we're dealing with 3 paths. We have the prescriptive, work area, or the performance approach. Okay, so that's our brief introduction. Now, 1 through 3, chapters 1 through 3 is our general items, right? Chapter 1 is almost a duplicate of what you have in chapter 1 of the building code. But there are a couple things that I want to highlight. Chapter 2, with all of our international codes, that's our definitions. So, and the definitions are very important in the IEBC because that actually is what includes our trigger. When we may have to do a seismic upgrade, when we may have to do an accessibility, any improvements or anything like that. Some of that is triggered directly by the definition that's included in chapter 2. And then chapter 3 is our general one that's going to apply to all performance paths we follow, whether it's the prescriptive, work area, or performance method. Okay. You can see in the 2018 code that there was some reorganization, and the two things that I want to point out were before the repairs, they had different provisions in the prescriptive and in the work area method. Now, if you're doing a repair to a building, it is its own standalone chapter. You don't have the option of following the prescriptive path or following the work area path or following the performance path. A repair to a building is going to comply with Chapter 4 of the IEBC. It's its own standalone chapter. Just like that, anytime you're going to relocate a building, if it's an existing building with foundation that you're lifting and moving somewhere else, or it's a modular that you're lifting or moving somewhere else, that now has its own standalone chapter as well, and that's Chapter 14 of the 2018 IEBC. So before they were mixed in, now they're their own chapters. Now, I really like this. They give you kind of an outline right away, and they tell you kind of how it's broken out. Repairs is going to be Chapter 4. The prescriptive path is in Chapter 5. Work area is Chapters 6 through 12. So that's really the majority of the IEBC. And then you have the performance path in Chapter 13. So I have a question here. It says, does the IEBC also pair with the IRC? Yes, it does. In fact, so the problem with the IRC is right at the beginning of the residential code, it tells you that it applies, the residential code applies to additions, alterations, or repairs that are made to a single family residence or townhouse. But it doesn't, but it says that you can't make it, you can't cause a dangerous condition or cause it to not be in compliance. The problem with the residential code is it doesn't tell you what you can and you can't do in relation to doing an addition so that you're not causing some harm to that existing building, whereas the IEBC walks you through that. It tells you, you know, if you're going to do this addition, you can't add any more than this amount of load to an existing element or something like that. So the IRC is supposed to be a standalone code, and you can use the IRC if you're just doing additions or alterations to a residential building, but you may want to delve into the IEBC. Okay. As far as the scope of the IEBC, it tells us right away in Chapter 1, we're dealing with the repair, alteration, change of occupancy, addition, or relocation of existing buildings. So it has these exceptions. If it's a 1 or a 2 family dwelling, we can go to the IRC. Townhouse, we can go to the IRC. If it's an accessory structure to one of those types of buildings, we can go to the IRC instead of the IEBC. But again, the IEBC gives us a more definitive way to handle it. Duties and powers of the building official. A couple of things are really important for us to understand that, you know, it's not new construction. These are existing buildings. All throughout the IEBC, it's going to talk about whether or not the building is located within a flood hazard area. So this is one of those areas where if you have that 100-year storm event, or the better way to say it is there's a 1% chance of exceedance that you might have floodwaters come up to that, you know, your floor area, wherever that base flood elevation is. If you're going to flood that existing building at all during that 100-year event, you are located within a flood hazard area. Well, if the work that you're doing to this existing building constitutes a substantial improvement, the building official is the one that makes that determination. And they're the ones that can tell you. And we're going to dig into that a little bit more, but that's a really important item with existing buildings. A lot of times they were allowed to build in certain areas, or now the flood hazard areas, you know, our flood insurance rate maps have totally changed. What wasn't in the 100-year floodplain now is. And so we really have to pay a lot of caution when we're dealing with existing buildings in flood areas. Another thing they talk about is preliminary meetings. The IEBC highly recommends this, that you as a designer or the building official, that you get together and you discuss these projects before you submit to seek a permit for that project, because they might tell you and give you other directions or things that could hopefully not kill a project, but could lead you in a different direction than you were initially planning on going. You wouldn't do that if you're doing a re-roof, but if you're doing a significant alteration or addition or a change of use to a building, you really may want to think about setting up a preliminary meeting. Okay, and then construction documents. The IEBC has this, but we have a little bit different language in the IEBC we should think about. So the building code says that when we're dealing with construction documents, these are submittal documents consisting of construction documents, so I think of plans and specs, statement of special inspections, a geotechnical report, and other data shall be submitted in 2 or more sets with each application for a permit. Well, the IEBC is just a little different. It's still construction documents, but then it says special inspection and structural observation programs. Investigation and evaluation reports and other data shall be submitted in 2 or more sets. Okay, so first, it adds the requirement of structural observations. In the building code, structural observations are only typically required by the engineer of record when you have a very tall building, a high-rise, 75 feet or more, right? If you have a risk category 3 or a 4 building, or if it's something that the building official or somebody would require because it's a complicated building or whatnot. Well, because we don't always know what we're getting into with existing buildings, now right away, the IEBC kind of recommends and encourages us to have structural observations done by the engineer of record on a project to ensure that those are constructed appropriately, that what they assumed is still what's found in the field. The second item is evaluation reports. This is something we're going to talk about. There's a lot of triggers that come into play as for when you need to have a structural evaluation of a building, things like that. It might help you to get out of some of the accessibility provisions that are there. So evaluation reports oftentimes might be tied to an existing building project. Okay, getting into chapter 2 are definitions. And remember, these are a lot of our key triggers. So I'm going to just highlight a couple, okay? A change of occupancy. It seems like the last several code cycles, they've revised the definition several times. This is the exact same definition we have in the building code, but just know they've clarified it. There's kind of 3 different scenarios. So it's when you're going to change the use of a building or just a portion of that building that could result in one of the following. So we're changing the occupancy classification. Let's say it was an S2 storage. Now we're going to an assembly A3 church. Now we're going to change from one group to another group in the same occupancy classification. So before it was an F2, and now I'm going to go to an F1. And F1 is a higher hazard. Any change in use within a group for which there is a change in application of the code. So just an example, let's say I have a group B occupancy. Well, it's going to be an ambulatory care facility. It still is a group B, but now there's a lot of other things in the code that could come into play. I'm thinking a lot of electrical provisions specifically that you're going to have to comply with for an ambulatory care that you wouldn't have to for a typical office building. So all of those could be a change of occupancy. It's just not going from an S to an A. It's within the same occupancy group, but a different classification, or even it could be its own classification if you have some additional code requirements that could come into play. Flood hazard area, we already talked about this, our 100-year event. Substantial damage. So this is a big one. So if the cost of restoring that building after a flood event exceeds 50% of the cost of that building before the damage occurred, then that's considered substantial damage. And they cannot simply repair it. They now need to make sure they're making that building comply with the flood provisions of either the IRC or the IBC. You know, getting up above the base flood elevation, other item, flood proofing, things like that. Similar to substantial damage, there's the term substantial improvement. So this is when the improvements you're going to be making exceed 50% of the market value. Now that may cause you to bring an existing building up to they may have to raise it above the base flood elevation. Again, this is still related to if you're in a flood hazard area only. There's a couple of exceptions that they have. Essentially, they really limit, you don't have to deal with a lot of finishes or things like that. Very good question. How do you determine market value? It is totally up to the purview of the building official. That's why you may want to do one of these preliminary meetings. In one of these slides, I believe FEMA has a substantial damage estimator, SDE. So if it's based on damage and not just improvement, you can do that. But really, it's up to you to show the building official what you feel like the value of the structure was before your improvement or before the damage, and then now what the cost is of the work that's going to be done. But it's up to the building official to make the determination whether or not you've hit substantial or 50%. Okay, now there's a tough one. I just had a call from a designer on this the other day. There was a casino that just totally collapsed. The roof collapsed, and they wanted to see about triggering this requirement. Substantial structural alterations to existing structural elements that combine to support more than 30% of the floor or the roof area, and then they make it even harder within a 5-year period of time, as if we're supposed to trigger, make sure we know everything that's happened within the last 5 years and make sure we haven't triggered this alteration requirement. Substantial structural damage is very confusing. The first bullet point here is in relation to lateral elements. The last two are in relation to gravity elements. So your vertical elements. So these are, let's say you have shear walls or moment frames or things like that. It says if you have decreased their capacity by as much as 33%, that's huge. And then our two gravity ones are the bottom, whether it's just our floor, regular floor or roof, dead and live loads, or if it's due to snow loads. If you have actual members that are supporting the gravity loads for 30% of a floor or roof area, and you decrease their capacity by 20% or more, then they're saying that's substantial structural damage. And that obviously is going to trigger some significant requirements. Technically unfeasible. This is one item I'm sure that Todd talked about in accessibility earlier today. This is an accessibility trigger only, where it gets you the exceptions, right? So you can get out of it. So if we have our bearing walls right here, if we have to meet a minimum egress width right here for our path of travel, now this bathroom that we have, we cannot expand it anymore without significant hardship. And so that's going to be technically infeasible to make that an accessible bathroom or to improve it to meet current accessibility provisions. Work area, if we're going to follow the work area route, that's one of the paths we can follow. We need to make sure the plans clearly show how that is. A lot of times people will show it by grayscaling the existing work and then by bold lines showing where all the new work occurs. But you need to make sure you're clearly showing what the work area is on the project. Okay, chapter 3. This again is going to, applies to all of our compliance methods. We have the prescriptive in chapter 5, work area 6 through 12, and then performance chapter 13. You need to remember this. You cannot combine them together, right? You can't, as an architect, you can't choose to say, hey, I want to follow the prescriptive path, but then the structural engineer record for the project follows the work area path. And then, well, the mechanical guy wants to do the performance path. You all, as a design team, have to stick to the same path, and you can't mix and match. Anytime we're dealing with, you're using the International Existing Building Code, any dangerous conditions can be called out at any time by the building official. They need to be remedied. I wish this was more clear, like those of you that were familiar with the Uniform Code for Abatement of Dangerous Buildings that we used to have, that was much more clear in relation to dangerous conditions than what the IEBC is. But the building official can cause them to be repaired at any time. Similar to the IEBC being a companion code to the building code, it also says you need to make sure you're in compliance with the energy conservation, the fire code. One thing for sure is right here, the property maintenance code comes into play quite a bit and is referenced throughout the IEBC. And then existing materials, they can always remain unless they are found to be unsafe. So if you have obviously asbestos, lead-based paint, mercury, those sorts of things, and you're doing work within those areas, you're going to have to make sure you're meeting the health department and other EPA, other regulations to comply with that. All new materials that you're going to be using in general should comply with the requirements for new construction, which is the building code. But there are some times that like materials are allowed in the IEBC, and so you can use like materials if that's all that's gotten triggered, regardless of using like or new construction requirements. All new structural elements that you're adding and their connections, those have to meet current requirements in the building code. Okay, 303 is a really important section. This is a lot of the triggers that are included throughout the IEBC address when you may require a structural evaluation. Remember the difference in chapter 1 as far as construction documents to the building official when you're seeking a permit. A lot of times an evaluation report may be required. Right here, there's 3 different sections we're going to talk about on these structural evaluations. One is live loads, one is snow loads, and then 3, we're going to get into our lateral or seismic. Okay, as far as live loads, if you're going to do an alteration or an addition to an existing building, and if the live loads do not change, you just need to make sure that everything's in compliance with the loads during the original construction. Now, if you're increasing the live loads, you need to show that you're meeting the requirements of 1607 in the IBC, right? So if I take a residence and I'm now going to make it into an office, before I had a live load of 40 pounds per square foot, now I have a live load of 50 pounds per square foot. I need to make sure that works. So the third option here is if it is a lesser live load, I mean, that the building official can approve a lesser live load. So why would you ever do that? Let's say I do allow somebody to purchase a single family residence and convert it over to an insurance office. Let's say we know that there's really not going to be more than 2 people in that office plus maybe two others. So, two clients. So we have 4 total people. I can see that it wouldn't really require an increase from the 40 PSF, and you could allow that as a building official. But if you allow it, then they need to placard that and note that. All right, I do have a question here. With so many codes, which is the one that we can use as the overall? I will tell, there is not one code that you can use as the overall. There is not one code, even though we say the IRC is a catch-all code that has everything. It's not. It references so much else. So I apologize. I'm not giving you the answer you want. You really have to have an understanding of all these codes. Now, from an architect's perspective, you need to really understand the requirements that are outlined in the building code. You're going to rely on a lot of other consultants to get the requirements in the mechanical code and the plumbing code. You may do your own energy conservation, so you need to be familiar with that. But architects in general, if you're dealing with a commercial project, you're going to need to have the IEBC and the IEBC hand in hand. If it's an existing building, you're going to use the IEBC, but you also have to be familiar with the IEBC. If it's new construction, you stick to the IEBC. You're relying on your consultants for a lot of the other codes for their specific discipline. So sorry, not a lot of help there. So that was live load evaluations. Now we may have to also do snow evaluations. Take a look at just this picture here, and hopefully you can see my cursor fine. This is an existing building, this 1 story right here, and then this is an existing building. So what they're doing is they're going to add an addition right here. Before, this is the uniform roof snow load they had. Here's a new balanced uniform roof snow load on that addition. But because of that, we're shading a portion of the roof. And so we're causing snowdrift to occur right there over that existing building. They're going to have to evaluate that. But in addition, this adjacent property, which is on a whole separate property, we have a property line and everything. If this is close enough, and if this is within 20 feet, and that space, this height is if that space is less than 6 times this height difference, we could also be causing snowdrift on that adjacent roof. So we may have to require an evaluation of the roof system of that adjacent property as well. So that's highlighted, that's noted in the IEBC. Not a fun one, but usually, hopefully you're dealing with more property and you're not built right up next to each other like that. But be aware of how additions can also affect snow requirements on that same building or adjacent properties. Okay, seismic. This is a big one. This is where a lot of the triggers are in Nevada. You definitely have a lot of seismic considerations that you have, and a lot of these triggers will come into play for you, whether you're in northern Nevada or southern Nevada. You all have to deal with it. So really, this is going to reference 2 different documents: the building code or ASCE 41. Which is for the seismic evaluation and retrofit of existing buildings. And that's what the structural engineer of record oftentimes will use if it's a pretty complicated existing building. Throughout the IEBC, they're going to tell you whether or not you have triggered a full seismic requirement or a reduced seismic. So section 303.3.1 addresses full seismic. What that means is code level. It's 100% of the IBC forces, or you can use this table that it tells you the ASCE 41 allows a lot of different options. So the IEBC gives you a table and it says if you're going to use that for the evaluation, you need to meet this minimum criteria. We won't dig into it. It gets really complicated. We don't have a lot of time. Also, for the IBC path, we need to consider, if we're doing a seismic evaluation, we need to assume that we're dealing with ordinary detailing. And what does that mean? Let's say we have a reinforced masonry shear wall building. In the code, there's a lot of different options, and one I don't even have on here is unreinforced. And you could assume unreinforced masonry. If it's ordinary, you get a response modification factor of 2. That's not your R value, right? This is the response modification factor. The higher this value, the better the building responds. If it's intermediate, you get an R of 3.5. If it's special, you get an R of 5. So this is in really throughout most of Nevada for new construction, the code requires you to design as a special reinforced masonry shear wall building. It has additional reinforcing and detailing that's done. So if we have to assume ordinary, unless they know otherwise, that's a big hit. That's only 40% of the value of what you would have had. So just keep that in mind. Now, again, there's full seismic or reduced seismic. If the trigger that's written in the IEBC tells you reduced seismic, then that evaluation is only to show that you meet 75% of the forces prescribed by the IEBC. They have another table for ASCE 41 that you can meet, or you can use the appendices in the IEBC. So really, the vast majority of this code book of the IEBC is the appendices. And a lot of that is just these options for reduced seismic if you want. So as an example, when they had the Northridge earthquake in Southern California, there was a lot of damage at the cripple walls of these buildings. So they have a way to kind of retrofit and repair this by adding additional sill anchors and reinforcing these cripple walls. That's one of the appendices, and there's several that are there. Again, you're probably going to defer that to one of your consultants that's doing the structural design of the project. All right, so that was the structural evaluations. Now, before accessibility, before the 2018 IEBC, all the accessibility provisions were mixed throughout. They were in the prescriptive path. They were in the work area path. They weren't in the performance because it kicked you back to the IEBC for that requirement. But now in relation to existing buildings, accessibility is all covered in section 305. So that's probably, as you deal with existing buildings, you're going to want to tab it. That's a section you're going to, as an architect, you're going to be referring to quite often in section 305 of the IEBC. So in general, it's requiring us to make sure we're in compliance with that, A117.1, the 2009 version. But it also has additional provisions, for maintenance, change of occupancy, additions, alterations, and change and existing buildings. It has provisions for historic buildings. And I know Todd went over some things today, but I'm not sure, I didn't listen to it all. Not sure if he did cover the IEBC references. Just as the IBC provides scoping provisions, we have revised scoping provisions for existing buildings within section 305. First, let's assume for accessibility purposes, we're dealing with a change of occupancy. It says for a change of use, now we need to make sure we have an accessible building entrance, an accessible route from the entrance to our primary function area. Accessibility signage has to be provided throughout. Accessible parking and passenger loading zones have to be provided. And we have to have an accessible route from that accessible parking to our accessible entrance. So in general, we feel like we're having to meet all of the requirements. And so that is the default. That's the default. There is an exception. Where it is technically infeasible, you can conform to the maximum extent that is technically feasible. Okay, so in general, when you're going to do a change of occupancy of an existing building, you have to meet all accessibility requirements, unless you can show there's certain items you can't meet because of where you have bearing walls, because you already have a minimum width for your means of egress and you can't encroach upon that. Things like that. Now, additions is a little different. This says the addition itself, obviously, I would hope, has to comply with the accessibility provisions of the IBC. So new construction requirements for the addition. Now, if our addition actually alters part of our primary function area, then we're going to have to also make sure we're providing accessibility to those primary function areas. Alterations. They need to comply with Chapter 11 for the work that, unless it is technically infeasible. So we still get that word, that definition back in. And then if it is technically infeasible, again, we still have to comply to the fullest extent possible that we can. And now when we're dealing with our primary function area, so if we do have an addition or an alteration that is affecting our primary function areas within the existing space of a building, we need to make sure that we have an accessible route to that primary function area. And of course, with that accessible route, we also need to make sure that we have proper accessible toilet facilities and drinking fountains. That's only if our alteration or our addition affect primary function areas of within the existing space. I did hear Todd mention earlier the 20% cost. Just so you know, that 20% trigger that's there, this exception, is only limited to the primary function area things that you have. If you're doing a change of use, the only trigger you have is technically infeasible. You can't pull out the 20% cost burden. Okay, that only applies to additions or alterations where you have to make sure you have an accessible route to the primary function areas. In that case, you can pull out this 20% cost of the alterations. Okay, there's a lot of scoping provisions that are provided throughout 305. Items for entrances, elevators, all of these different items, amusement rides. We can't go into them all. Just know that they're typically a little less stringent than what you would have in the IBC for new construction. But if you have any of those elements, you do have to comply. Now, in relation to historic buildings, in general, they say you need to provide accessibility unless it's technically infeasible, or if you can show that the compliance threatens to destroy the historic fabric of that building. This is the general, now of course, this is from the ADAG website, but a couple of things that you're supposed to have. You're supposed to have at least one accessible route from an arrival point to an accessible entrance. This looks like the main entrance. The main entrance does not have to be accessible for a historic building. So this one they make accessible. And so we have to have an accessible route to that entrance. You have to have at least one toilet room. It could be a family assisted toilet room. So those are really the accessibility provisions that they have for historic buildings in 3059. Okay, so now let's move on. We went over the general provisions. Let's dig into repairs. Again, this has its own chapter now. This is chapter 4 of the IEBC. You don't get to go follow prescriptive work area or any of that. You have to deal with repairs in chapter 4. You cannot make any building less conforming if substantial damage did occur and you're in a flood hazard area. You need to make sure that building is brought up above the base flood elevation. You're designing it to comply with the requirements for the IBC or the IRC. Anytime you're going to replace glazing, and that glazing is located within a hazardous location, I think we're well aware, most of you are aware, right, of where that might be, near any wet surfaces, next to doors, things like that. We need to make sure that we have the appropriate glazing in those hazardous locations, not replacing in kind. Okay, in relation to structural on repairs, as long as the damage that occurred that you're repairing is less than substantial, you can repair it to its pre-damage state. One caveat to that is if that damage was due to snow, like you would see in this image right here, they need to, maybe the snow that they used at the time it was originally constructed, the design snow load was way too little. In that instance, if damage was due to snow, you have to show that the structure is going to be able to withstand the current snow loads at that location. Now, if it's substantial structural damage, which we already went on, we did a definition of that, and it's very significant. That was the one where we talked about 2 gravity triggers or our lateral trigger. They need to give us an evaluation. They need to consider all of this, but it can be reduced seismic when they do their evaluation. If their evaluation shows that it is a compliant building, they can then restore it to its pre-damage state. If they show that it's non-compliant, they are going to have to upgrade the building to make sure that it is able to withstand 100% wind, the reduced seismic, 75% IBC seismic, all the gravity loads, things like that. Again, we already talked about the flood hazard area, so I'll skip that. Other things when we're doing repairs, there's just a couple of electrical items we should be aware of. You can, in general, replace with like material, but receptacles have to comply with 406 of the electric code, right? Grounding type, GFCI, AFCI, tamper resistant, those types of receptacles need to be installed. And if they have the Edison base type plug fuses, if you can see any tampering or fusing that's done, they need to replace those fuses. If you're in an I2 occupancy and it has non-hospital grade receptacles, they all need to be upgraded to hospital grade receptacles. And then if we're dealing with, if we have we have appliances that aren't grounded, we need to make sure that we somehow are able to ground those elements. Okay, mechanical draft systems is the main thing that really comes into play here. If you have one, if you're going to install one, you need to make sure it's listed. It needs to have visible, audible warning that's provided, smoke detection, battery backup, those sorts of things need to be provided with that. So if you're going to add a gas fireplace within a master bedroom or something, it wasn't there before, you need to make sure these items are addressed. In relation to plumbing, it's really just no big deal. You just have to make sure that you're not, you can replace with like kind materials as long as they're not prohibited by the plumbing code. And it's just when you're going to replace a toilet or a water closet, you need to make sure that it's an efficiency toilet, which pretty well they all are, and it's hard to get one that doesn't meet these code provisions now. Okay, so that's just the repair section. It's pretty easy. Now, the prescriptive path. This is what I've always called the Betty Crocker, the cookbook. This is the one that really kind of walks us through what we used to know. Most of us have been in this industry for a while. We were very familiar with Chapter 34 of the Building Code. Now, really, that is gone. That was taken out. 2012 was the last year. And those provisions really are what we have now in Chapter 5 of the IEBC. It's very, very, very similar. The one thing about this is there are some exceptions. Bleachers and grandstands, those need to follow a separate standard created by ICC. Again, we can't mix our paths once we're following this. We need to stick to prescriptive all the way through. If we're going to do an addition to an existing building, the addition itself has to comply with the building code. We've talked about that. Alterations to the existing building need to make sure that the existing building is no less in compliance than it was prior to that addition. Sometimes, like from a structural perspective, if you do an addition, it may cause a reentrant corner or a structural irregularity, and that needs to be addressed. So that's really what they're after there. You need to make sure that this addition that you're doing with the existing portion of the building, those combined, that you have not exceeded your allowable heights and area and story provisions of Chapter 5 in the building code. A flood hazard area. So there's a couple of pictures here I hope will be helpful. If it's less than a substantial improvement, nothing really needs to be done, no specific, but if it is a substantial improvement, now we're going to have to raise it all. So here we see they've raised, this is the existing building, this is the addition. They've had to raise them both to be above that base flood elevation. Whoops, I was on the wrong picture showing that to you guys, and I apologize. I have 3 screens going, and it was on the wrong screen. So if it's less than substantial, just the addition needs to be raised. If it is substantial, now the existing building and the addition need to be raised to be above the base flood elevation. Sorry about that. Okay, and then now this is real in structure. You know, most of you are architects. When it comes to the structural triggers, I think 2 things you should always keep in mind with existing buildings is the gravity and the lateral triggers. For gravity, it's the 5% rule. In general, am I adding more than 5% load to an existing gravity element? Or have I decreased its capacity in any way? I hope you would all know that somebody came through here, they definitely decreased the capacity of this element, all right? So that needs to be either altered, replaced, repaired, whatever, to make sure it can meet and support the current building code load criteria. The lateral trigger is 10%. So if you're going to be attaching this addition to the existing building, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we have a gap between them. But if you're going to be attaching them, you cannot increase more than 10% lateral load to that element or decrease its capacity by 10%. So the lateral is a 10% rule, the gravity is a 5% rule. Now the 5% rule, that is associated with just that gravity element. But the 10% rule is for the building as a whole. Once you've triggered this requirement, you can't just, hey, let's say I cut out a lot of a shear wall. I can't just strengthen that shear wall. I now have to evaluate the entire building. The reason that trigger is there is it allows the opportunity for the building official to make sure these buildings are safe. This trigger, if you hit the 10% rule lateral for doing an addition, it's full seismic, 100% IBC, as we talked about in 303 of the IEBC. Here's the way out. Let's say you have an existing building, it's unreinforced masonry. We have 2 widths of brick, rubble foundation. It would have cost too much to upgrade it all. So we have a seismic gap between the 2, eccentric footing. And so we just tell them, this is now designed to meet 100% code requirements. We tell the owner, you feel any shaking, run to the addition. And that's what you do. But that is an allowance. If you can make the addition structurally independent, then you haven't triggered a requirement to upgrade the existing building. This is just to go over it a little bit. Here we have an existing building. We have, and what they're going to do is they want to do an addition. They want to add a kitchen and then a covered patio. So now I have this new roof area, and I take half of that and take it over here. So this wall right here, this bearing wall, is now supporting more than 10%, right? Or if it's bearing, let's say gravity, 5%, but now let's call it a shear wall. But more than that, I've also decreased its capacity by taking out a lot of the wall. Even though I had a window here, I took out some additional portion of that wall. I definitely hit the 5% gravity, the 10% lateral triggers. They need to do an evaluation of this entire building and show that it meets. Okay, prescriptive requirements. So, and hopefully we're all familiar with this. Anytime we're touching anything that's a group R in most I occupancies, actually, we may have to be adding smoke alarms, CO detection, right? So required throughout group R or I1, and we need to locate them just like the fire code or the building code requires us. Same thing with carbon monoxide. These are group R, I1, I2, and I4 occupancies. And then also there's a requirement in 502 that if we have storm shelters, if we're doing an addition to a group E occupancy and we're within an area that requires storm shelters, you need to show that the existing storm shelters can handle the additional occupancy that you have from the addition, or you need to add a new storm shelter that's compliant with the building code requirements. Okay, we have a question. So high-rise building, it's over 20 floors from the 1960s. It's horizontal corridors and vertical shaft pressurization compliance triggered in going from transient hotel to permanent apartment. I mean, you are changing it, you know, you're going, you know, from an R1 to an R2. There's the requirement. So the building official has the opportunity to state whether or not they say it's the same or a less hazardous occupancy in your change of use. And if that's the case, then a lot of the change of use triggers may not be required, but it is up to the building official to make that call. And it gives the building official a lot of leeway. So the trick is just to show in your analysis to them, you know, and have a preliminary meeting to say, hey, you know, we are making this less or the same level of hazard as it was previous in this change of occupancy. And so in that case, they might not require that, or maybe they would, maybe there'd be a meet the halfway sort of thing. But they do. That's in the change of occupancy section that we'll get to, and they leave it up to the building official to meet that exception, which is if the change of occupancy is equal or less hazardous. So, but yeah, that's a good question. Okay, we already went over the lateral triggers and the gravity triggers. So 5%, 10%. Now, a couple other things you should be aware of with existing buildings that might come into play and could be a costly addition to your project, depending upon what type of building you're dealing with. A lot of times you're in seismic design category D throughout Nevada, although a lot of places you're seismic design category C. So some will apply, some won't. So here, if we have unreinforced masonry parapets, and if you're going to be doing a re-roof at all, it requires you then to brace the parapets. It does say it's reduced seismic, so that evaluation that the engineer of record does is just as 75% of the IBC forces. Also, if we have a reinforced masonry or reinforced concrete building that has a flexible diaphragm or a wood diaphragm, then they also need to evaluate the roof to wall anchorage. So just as an example, one of the reasons for this is the older tilt-ups that were done in the 70s. The roof-to-wall attachment was highly inadequate, and also during the Northridge earthquake, they found a lot of them collapsed. So that roof-to-wall connection is key to collapse prevention and holding a building together and letting people get out. So they have this trigger that if you're going to be altering at least 50% of the area within that existing building, and it's composed of concrete or masonry walls and a wood diaphragm, then they need to evaluate the roof-to-wall connections and make sure that they meet the 75% or reduced seismic force level. Similarly, if we have unreinforced masonry buildings and we're in seismic design category C or above, 50% of the area is being effective, then they'll have to add that. Maybe not add the connections, but evaluate the roof to wall connections. And even if you're not doing a re-roof, if you are going to be affecting at least 50% of the area of an existing building as part of your alteration, they require the bracing of the unreinforced masonry parapets. A lot of times we'll see these older buildings, a lot of older school buildings have this where they're concrete frame buildings and they have masonry infill walls. Now they have this requirement that those masonry infill, that has to either be removed or reinforced to meet the reduced seismic. Substantial structural alterations, again, that's one of the triggers we had talked about earlier. And just so you know, anytime we're doing an alteration, if an alteration triggers a seismic evaluation per 303 of the building, of the IEBC, it's always reduced seismic. If we're doing an addition and we have to do an evaluation, it's always to full seismic. So additions, 100% IBC force level. Alterations is just 75%. So it's not just seismic that's covered in the existing building code, it's also wind. If you're in areas that have high wind, greater than 115 miles per hour, design wind speed, if you're going to replace it, be replacing at least 50% of your roofing materials, they require you to evaluate the diaphragm and the roof to wall connections of those buildings. Make sure you're at least meeting the 75% of the wind requirements of the building code. And if not, you need to strengthen them. Strengthen all your diaphragm connections and your roof to wall connections. Just like in repairs, we have the requirements here. If we're doing alterations in a group R or I1, we need to add smoke alarms. In R, I1, I2, I4, we need to add carbon monoxide alarms. Another thing they note here is if you have existing refuge areas, any alterations that you're doing, you need to make sure that you're not affecting them so as they won't comply with the requirements for smoke compartments in I1 and I2 and I3, ambulatory care facilities and horizontal exits. You need to make sure that they still satisfy the requirements for those uses. Fire escapes. So obviously, this is something that we do not have in the building code for new construction, but in a lot of our areas, in older Las Vegas and older Reno, you might find some older buildings, tall buildings that did have fire escapes for exits. So the IEBC addresses fire escapes and how we handle them and not the building code itself. They are not allowed in new construction, but we may still have them for existing construction, and we need to make sure we're meeting minimum criteria. So the IEBC highlights some of that. And if you're doing a change of occupancy for an existing building, and you need to now have two exits, or maybe you need to have one additional exit at least from what you have available to you. This allows you to incorporate new fire escapes into it as part of that change of occupancy, so long as you're not meeting, you're not exceeding 50% of your required exits are from a fire escape. So there's a lot of provisions, and you can dig into it more if you want to. We won't spend much time on it here. Now, our emergency escape and rescue openings. A lot of changes occurred in the 2018 codes you guys might be aware of. But right now, there's some things I want to highlight for existing buildings. For sure, our opening control devices that we have at our upper story windows. If it's an operable window, if the top of the sill is less than 36 inches from the floor, and the distance to grade is 72 inches or more, we need to make sure that we have an opening control device that won't allow anything to pass through more than 4 inches. Now, our replacement rescue openings. Now, if it's an R2 and an R3, it says they're exempt from the IBC or the IRC requirements, provided that the replacement window is the largest size that can fit in the existing opening, and it provides for an equal or a greater window opening area. And I bring this up, my wife grew up and she had a basement room with windows just like this. If this was an existing space that was used as a bedroom, then this would apply. If now we're doing a change of occupancy within that space and we're altering it to now be occupied as a bedroom, we do need to alter these windows to comply with the IBC or IRC requirements. Unless we do meet the other, they have another exception now that's there, that if you have 2 other exits out of the basement, then you may not have to have the emergency escape and rescue opening from that room itself. So that's a new provision. Not quite sure why it's there, but it's there. Okay, now prescriptive, we're still in the prescriptive path, chapter 5, change of occupancy. So no change can happen unless that building is shown to comply with the IEBC. And this is what I was talking about before, the second bullet point. It's up to the building official to note whether or not that occupancy is the same or less hazardous from a fire and life safety risk perspective. So it's really up to them, and it's up to you to provide that argument early on in the process. So less hazardous, and I think you could definitely say that, going from an R1 to an R2 in the scenario we talked about before. Okay, anytime we have a change of occupancy, the building official has to now issue a certificate of occupancy. Their stairs are not required to comply with the requirements of the IBC, where the existing space and the construction does not allow a reduction in pitch or slope. So it's kind of going back to our accessibility technically and feasible term or definition we have. Okay, when we hit our triggers for a change of occupancy, it makes us go to full seismic. So live loads have to conform with the IBC. Snow and wind loads, if you haven't changed anything, you're good. If we go to a different risk category, if before it was an office building, no, let's say before it was a warehouse and now it's going to be a church. Now we've made it a risk category 3 building in all likelihood. We now need to show in our evaluation as part of that change of occupancy that we meet all snow, wind, and seismic requirements to show that they meet the full IBC requirements. Historic buildings, following the prescriptive approach, they are not required to meet the provisions of this, provided that building official deems there's not a distinct life safety risk. So I will highlight right now, again, there's 3 paths you can go. The way the prescriptive path addresses historic buildings, I do not like at all as a code official, because right here it puts all the onus on the code official. Whereas if we go into the work area path, which we'll talk about in a little bit, it actually requires the design team and the owner to put together an evaluation of that historic building to note what items they are not in conformance with from a life safety perspective, why those items may not be able to be addressed in order to keep the historic fabric of the building, or you know, and then there's supposed to be a meeting of the minds with the building official. In this instance, the code doesn't really say that you have to have this evaluation with the design team and discuss it. I really like the evaluation. So, okay, so that's the prescriptive path. We went over all that. We've gone over repairs. We've gone over the prescriptive approach, and now let's talk about the work area method. Again, this is chapters 6 through 12. I'm going to probably be skipping some slides a lot because there's a lot of repetition from the prescriptive path. Right away, chapter 6 just tells you how they break it out. That in chapter 7, they'll talk about alteration level 1. Chapter 8, level 2 alterations. Chapter 9, level 3 alterations. They just break it out. In general, here alterations, they give them different categories. So a level 1 alteration is if we're going to remove or replace any existing equipment. We're going to add a new roof covering, replace the roof. Or a re-roof permit. So really, really minor items. Alteration level 2, now we're going to start to reconfigure the space a bit. We might cut some new door openings or window openings, add some equipment rather than replace existing equipment. We're going to add equipment now. Level 3 is a lot bigger. Not only are we reconfiguring the space, we're probably reconfiguring 50% of or more of the entire building there, the aggregate building area. Okay, so chapter 7, we're doing level 1 alterations, probably a lot of re-roof stuff. So roof replacement, siding, my slide says new equipment loads. That's not the case. It's replacement equipment, not new. So we shouldn't be seeing things like this, right? It goes through all the requirements we have in the building code, that depending upon the type of materials, how many layers of roofing we can have. A roof replacement per the IEBC, it means we're replacing all the existing layers of roofing. We're down to the roof deck. A roof recover is we're now going to be putting new roofing materials over existing roofing materials. They allow you in the IEBC to do that as long as the new roofing is installed per the manufacturer requirements. You have a complete and separate roofing system that does not rely on the existing roof for support. So a standing seam metal roof could do that. There's specific provisions for metal panel or concrete clay tile that are installed over shake roofs. And that's just to make sure that we're not creating a fire hazard there. So 7054 of the IEBC discusses that. Also, there's a new protective roof coating sometimes that you can apply even if you're following all of these. If it's a soaked roof, if you have dangerous materials, things like that, that you should not be doing a roof recover. One thing I didn't say there, just know with the re-roof, some of the triggers we talked about under the prescriptive still apply. We may have to have our URM parapet bracing. We may need to, in high wind regions, reinforce or evaluate our roof diaphragm and roof to wall connections. Now, level 2 alterations are going to be getting a little more involved. We're going to now reconfigure the space. Once it's a level 2, we have to comply with Chapter 7 and Chapter 8, both together, okay? There are some requirements that they have for vertical openings, fire protection systems, things like that come into play with this. So your existing vertical openings, I'm going to first freak you out a little bit. Existing openings connecting 2 or more floor levels shall be enclosed with 1 hour fire rated construction. With that said, with the code, we always have exceptions, and there's 14 exceptions. And a lot of times you can get out of this. And that's really the general default that they want you to do. And it's up to you to determine whether or not you meet one of those 14 exceptions. If you're affecting a work area of greater than 50%, it really should be a level 3 alteration. And enclosure requirements for the vertical openings, it does definitely come into play. Smoke compartments. So when we're dealing with I2 occupancies, if you have more than 30 patients on a story, and you have to make sure you're dividing it in no less than 2 compartments by means of smoke barriers. Guards, you have to make sure you're providing guards at every area where you have a 30-inch drop or more. Existing guards are fine even if they're not in compliance height-wise, but if they're structurally unsound, if they're going to fail pretty shortly, then you do need to replace those guards. And once you replace them, you need to make sure they're in compliance with current code provisions. Fire protection. If we're going to affect, we're doing an alteration within a space, once you hit this fire protection requirement, you now have to do it throughout that entire floor. If it's a high-rise building, we have to have fire sprinklers. So if it didn't have it before, now it does. If you're a group A, B, all of these, and you have exits or corridors that are serving greater than 30 occupants, we need to make sure we have sprinkler protection. If we have windowless stories, we need to make sure we have sprinkler protection. Now, standpipes, whereas the building code tells us we need to have standpipes within all new buildings that have an occupiable floor level that's 30 feet or more above the lowest level of fire department access, the IEBC says 50 feet. So we have an occupiable floor of 50 feet above the lowest level of fire department access. So if it does not have an existing standpipe system, we need to add it if we have floors above 50 feet. Those standpipe connections now need to be provided at each level. They have to be installed in accordance with the IEBC and of course, the IFC, which is a duplicate. Fire alarms. So anytime the fire code would require them for a group E, I1, I2, I3, R1, or R2 occupancy, we need to now provide them for these existing buildings that we're performing level 2 alterations in. If you are affecting a work area of greater than 50%, that fire alarm system now has to occupy the entire floor level. Okay, fire protection systems. So we're still in that, sorry. Smoke alarms have to be provided throughout our R and our I1, carbon monoxide, our R's and our I1, I2, I4. Same as what we've talked about before under the prescriptive approach and the repairs. Means of egress. This only gets triggered when you're dealing with 2 occupants, 2 tenants or more within the work area that you are altering. So it only applies to that work area. There are some times that you might trigger some things within 805 that would require you now to do the entire floor area as well. Number of exits have to comply with the IBC, but when there's more than 1 tenant and they go through and they say, so if you have more than 1 tenant and based on these occupants that you have, they'll go through and tell you whether or not you can get by with 1 exit. It's going to be a little different than the provisions that we have. So this is what we have in the IBC. Now these are the provisions that they also include in the IEBC. So for an R2 occupancies down here, we have B, F2, and S2s. So they're a little less stringent than what we would have in the IBC requirements. Fire escapes, we already discussed the fire escapes and what's that. New fire escapes can be installed. Mezzanines. Now we have a lot of new mezzanine provisions in both the building code and in the IEBC. 2 exits are required when you have more than 50 occupants on that mezzanine level or the travel distance exceeds 75 feet. Or if we have a group A, we have our main entrance. When you're serving an occupant load of 30 or more, 300 or more, that main entrance must be capable of serving at least half of the occupant load. I think we all understand that. Everybody, that's what people are most comfortable with and where they're most likely to return to, so 50%. Our egress doorways, at least when you have 2 are required, if you have greater than 50 occupants, greater 75-foot travel distance, and in our I2 patient sleeping rooms where the suites are greater than 1,000 square feet, your door swing, door closing, panic hardware, all that stuff has to comply with the building code requirements. Now, if we have existing openings in corridor walls, unless the IBC would not require that corridor to be rated, we now need to make sure that those penetrations, those openings are compliant. So corridor doors, they cannot consist of hollow core, they cannot have louvers, transoms, you have to make sure that we have appropriate fire rating of those, and any other openings need to be sealed and meet all of our penetration limitations that are in Chapter 7 of the IBC. Means of egress lighting, we have to be provided. If it's greater than 50% of the floor area, you have to now do it throughout that entire floor level. Artificial lighting has to be provided for the IBC. Dead end corridors cannot exceed 35 feet. Now, exit signs, we do want to make sure that exit signs are being provided throughout the space that we are altering, wherever the IBC would require them. And now if we're altering more than 50% of the floor, that entire floor level. Handrails, they're going to have to be provided. Anytime you have greater than 2 risers, 1 handrail has to be provided. If it's greater than 66 inches in width, you need to have 1 on each side. Guards, we already went over guards, the exact same provisions there. An existing guard can remain unless it's structurally inadequate. Okay, electrical, this is a big one. New installations, all new installations has to meet the current NEC provisions. If you're doing wiring within an A1, A2, A5, H, or an I occupancy, they have to be upgraded to current NEC provisions. If it's an R2, R3, or an R4, they also need to meet the provisions of 807.3. So they have, receptacle requirements for GFCI, arc fault protection, things like that. So those have to be met as well. So level 2 alterations, mechanical. We just need to make sure that we have natural or mechanical ventilation that meets the requirements of the mechanical code. Here I'm of course referencing the IMC, and I know, I think I've already done that in the past, and I know that throughout most of Nevada you're using the UMC and the UPC. The only time plumbing comes into play is if that alteration that you're doing may cause an increase in the occupant load of more than 20%. If it's more than 20%, now you need to show that all the plumbing meets the requirements of the adopted plumbing code. Energy, the alterations only, not the entire building, have to meet the energy conservation requirements. Okay, level 3 alterations. So we're gutting this building. We're doing a lot of work, right? It has to be more than 50% of the work area of that building. So it's going to be very significant. We are now required to comply with Chapter 7, Chapter 8, and Chapter 9. Now, if they're high-rise buildings, we need to make sure that we have recirculating air or exhaust systems with smoke and heat detection if they're pushing more than 15,000 CFM. At least one elevator is going to have to meet the emergency operation requirements of ASME A1A17.3. And then if in our boiler and furnace rooms, if they're adjacent to an I1, I2, I4, R1, R2, or R4, they need to be enclosed by 1 hour rated construction. Existing shafts, all existing stairways that are part of the means of egress are required to be enclosed for level 3 alterations. All R3 fire separations, if they're not continuous from the foundation to the underside of the roof sheathing, shall be altered to provide a continuous fire separation. So in our townhomes, things like that. Fire protection, now sprinklers. If we have more than one tenant and the building is serving an occupant load of more than 30 people, we have high-rise buildings, rubbish and linen chutes, upholstered furniture or mattresses. That's when we need to make sure we have fire suppression there. It also says when required by IBC table 903.211.6. This is just a small snapshot of that table. Very good to be familiar with that table and see if fire suppression may need to be addressed because you have one of those uses within the space and it was not pre-treated. Even if it was existing, now that alteration is triggering the requirement to make sure that fire suppression is provided. Fire alarms. So we need to make sure we have manual alarms and notification appliances as would be required by the IEBC. Automatic fire detection has to be provided throughout the work area. Means of egress, we have to have our means of egress lighting, our exit signs, all of that throughout the work area space. And energy, again, it's the same. It's just the items, the alterations and things that you're doing. The entire building does not have to comply. It's just the altered area that does. Okay. No more questions. I probably lost you all. This is a lot of talking. It's a lot of slides that we're going through, so I apologize. Chapter 10, our change of occupancy that we might have within the building. When the change of use is changed to one of the following, the building itself shall fully comply with the IBC. So regardless of all the other things we're going to talk about in Chapter 10 under the work area path, if you have atriums, you have to comply with the IBC. If you have motor vehicle related occupancies, you have to comply with the IBC. So if you have one of these uses, you just be aware of that. Okay, electrical. Any type of special occupancy we have within the building that could have one of these, if you have hazardous locations, commercial garages, aircraft hangars, gas dispensing facilities, bulk storage plants, spray applications, healthcare facilities. There's a lot of different hazards that come into play with these types of uses that are specifically called out in the NEC. And so if you're doing a change of occupancy and one of those is going to be there, your electrical provisions are going to need to be brought up to meet current NEC requirements. All unsafe conditions have to be addressed in relation to that change of occupancy that's occurred as far as the electrical goes. You have to have a service upgrade that complies with the NEC for the new occupancy. The electrical outlets have to comply with the NEC within the portion of the building where the occupancy has been changed. We know most of you are probably well aware of all the receptacle requirements that we have within residential occupancies. And so just if you're going to be revising it, you need to make sure you're meeting, you know, the spacing requirements, that the right receptacles are being specified. As far as mechanical, your kitchen exhaust, mechanical ventilation, all of that stuff is going to have to comply with the mechanical code. Typically the UMC in Nevada, but I know a lot of you also allow the IMC as an alternate means. Plumbing. If we have an increased demand based on this new change of occupancy that we have, or an increase to the water supply demands, we need to make sure that we're complying with the current plumbing code requirements. If it's a food handling occupancy that we're changing this to, all existing sanitary waste lines near the food preparation or storage areas have to be panned or protected in accordance with the plumbing code. Grease interceptors, if it's a new occupancy that will produce grease or oil-laden waste, we need to make sure we're meeting the grease interceptor requirements of the plumbing code. Now chemical waste. A lot of times we might have a new occupancy that will produce chemical waste. I'm just thinking, a lot of reviews I've done in Nevada, I've done several of the extraction facilities. Right now, we have the growth facilities, and then we have the extraction. A lot of times they're combined, and just think about that. A lot of these might be producing chemical waste as part of their growing and extraction processes. They need to show that all the existing piping that is not compatible with waste is that the waste is going to be either neutralized, or they're going to have to change all of the piping system to show that it's not going to be a deterrent. And then they need to show that it's not going to discharge to the public sewer. If it's a group I2, all plumbing needs to conform with the current plumbing code requirements. Okay, our lighting and ventilation has to comply with the IBC for the new occupancy. Non-separated occupancies, if fire barriers complying with IBC Table 5084 are not provided to separate the occupancy, the entire building has to comply with Chapter 9 of the IEBC. So that was our Level 3 alterations that we talked about. Now, separated occupancies, just the separated portion has to comply with Chapter 9. Okay, if IBC Chapter 9 would require sprinkler suppression or sprinkler protection of the new change of occupancy, then we have to have fire suppression there. Same thing, IBC Chapter 9 or IFC Chapter 9 requires fire alarms throughout that space. Based on that new occupancy, we have to provide the fire alarms there. Now, it's important that we also, if for change of occupancy, you need to be aware of these tables if you're following the work area path. This table is just the means of egress hazard categories, and there's others that we're going to have. So if you were a B and you're now going to an A, it shows that you've increased in your high hazard level. Earlier, we talked about how, what's the difference between, an R1 or an R2. Here, it's going to show it's at the same hazard level. So that's one argument you can make with the building official going from, a hotel to an apartment building, that if you're looking at Chapter 10 of the IEBC and the different hazard category tables, we have not increased the hazard at all as part of this change of occupancy. If it's equal to or lower, you can just make sure you're meeting the means of egress requirements of Chapter 9 Level 3 alterations that we talked about. If it's a newly constructed egress element, it has to comply with the IBC. If you have increased the hazard level, you have to make sure that you comply with the means of egress provisions of the IBC Chapter 10. there's a table as far as egress capacity. Sorry, I got confused on my thing here. So we've already talked about handrails and guards. All of that still happens. You know, you need to make sure that if you have existing handrails, that they need to, as long as they're structurally sound, they can be there. The same thing with existing guards. They don't have to comply with current handrail and guard provisions. Heights and areas. So again, Chapter 5 of the Building Code. There's a new provision that's in here in the IEBC that you might want to be aware of. And I think that's on the next slide that I have. But here is a heights and area hazard category table. Let's look at the same thing we said before, an R1 to an R2. It's in the same hazard category. You didn't change or increase. Equal or lower, the existing conditions acceptable. If you go to a higher based on your change of use, now you have to make sure you're compliant with the IEBC Chapter 5. So this is the firewall alternative. A lot of times we're used to firewalls that we will, you know, in order to meet the Chapter 5 provisions for allowable heights and area, we will add firewalls to buildings so that we can make a larger building and have more occupants. We just break them up between those spaces. Well, they do allow a firewall alternative in the IEBC. They allow you to install fire barriers or horizontal assemblies in lieu of an actual firewall. You can't do this in groups H, F1, or S1 occupancies. The entire building has to be sprinklered. Typically, it's the type of building that would be anyhow. The maximum allowable area that you have on either side of that firewall cannot exceed the values in Chapter 5 of the IEBC, assuming you have, without the sprinkler increase. And then the fire resistance rating of your fire barrier has to comply with the firewall rating. That's in 706.4 of the IEBC. But other things you don't have to do, you don't have to have, you know, the parapet that goes up, you don't have to have the extensions out, you don't have to have some of the other, you know, provisions that come into play, structural stability of firewalls. As long as you're meeting the fire barrier continuity requirements and having the fire rating for that firewall, you can use this alternative. All right, so there's a question. I'm glad somebody's out there. Thank you. Do handrails for existing buildings have to meet different ADA codes if existing? So the same thing with guards and handrails apply. If you have existing handrails and guards, they're not requiring them to meet current IEBC requirements unless they are structurally unstable. Once you have to replace them, then you do have to meet current code requirements. So that's one of the exceptions that's in the IEBC. And so now you were talking about accessibility provisions and things like that. That's different, and we have to always be careful, right? ADA and what can always come into play on some of these public buildings at any time. But the IEBC allows you to maintain existing handrails and guards as long as they're structurally sound. They don't have to meet the limitation or graspability, you know, the height restrictions or the graspability and other things like that. Many of us have probably walked up to a historic building, up to a guard, and thought that that was going to be, it looked more like a tripping hazard than an actual deterrent. And they're, some of them are pretty scary, but the IEBC allows you to maintain them. Okay, another question. When do roof equipment guards come into play? Now, so the IEBC doesn't talk about roof equipment guards. Now, I know, and I think you're talking about, so there's a couple of different things you have. So you have the provisions where you have a roof access hatch, and depending upon how close you are to the edge of the roof, that you might need to have guards that are there to protect you. You have screen walls around rooftop equipment. You have, so I guess I don't necessarily understand that, but those, I would almost think if it's like that, like the roof hatch when you're coming up and you have a guard that's supposed to protect you near the edge of a roof, I would almost think that would have to comply with current code requirements, just to make sure Yeah, so thank you. I was going to say OSHA too. A lot of the roof equipment guards are addressed by OSHA. They give you specific provisions, and so really those OSHA could come out and enforce those requirements at any time, just like the federal government can in relation to ADA guidelines. But the building code does talk about adding some guards and protection there when you're near the edge of the roof and you have an access opening. Okay, exterior walls. Again, we're dealing with change of occupancies. And we have an exterior wall exposure hazard category. Before, this still has our R1, R2 in the same category there. That's good to note. Equal or lesser, the existing conditions acceptable. If we go to a higher hazard, then we need to make sure we're meeting the IEBC requirements for fire resistive construction. Okay, enclosure of vertical shafts. You need to make sure you're complying with the IEBC requirements in relation to vertical shafts. If we've gone to a higher hazard category, all stairways and other vertical shafts have to comply with the IEBC. The IEBC does have some exceptions, but in general, we're going to be dealing with Chapter 7 of the IEBC there. And then openings that go into shafts shall be protected by assemblies having a 1-hour rating and have self-closing if that applies, such as your laundry chutes or trash chutes. Okay, another question. So we have the historic building code, the existing building code, and the building code. Do they work together, or is there some system of determining which one applies in case of conflict? No, thank you for the question. And I apologize. I was asked to talk about the IEBC, so I didn't look to see if the state of Nevada had a historic building code. Most states do not. And the way most states handle historic buildings is based on the IEBC, the existing building code. So if the state of Nevada does have a historic building code, you are going to need to comply with that for the historic building portion. In case of a conflict, what governs? I highly recommend those preliminary meetings and you discuss with the building official about that project and what you're planning on doing and making sure you're all on the same page. Make sure you do your homework ahead of time. You know why you want to stick to one section. Make sure they buy off on it. Don't just accept them saying it verbally too. Try to make sure they get it in writing. So you have that to go back to, because a lot of times you're going to be submitting that for a permit several months after that conversation occurred. That building official may not even be there. They may not remember it. And they might just be trying to cover for a mistake that they might have made in allowing it. So try to make sure you get those in writing. In general, the building code is what you're going to be using. Okay, so let's see. Thank you. Let's see. Historic buildings here will come under the Department of Interior guidelines. Okay, that makes sense. I know we have, I'm in Utah. I do reviews all over the West Coast and stuff. So I've dealt with the California Historic Building Code, but we don't have one. But we do have a state historic architect that we deal with a lot of times. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful. So I would think that the Department of Interior guidelines, it's only, but why don't they probably are only going to be involved for national or state historic buildings, whereas if you're in a local historic district or something like that, maybe it wouldn't fall under theirs and it would fall under the existing building code. I'm not sure. Okay, hopefully it was helpful. A lot of homework on your end to figure that out, sorry. Okay, additions. Now this chapter 11, again, we're still in the work area path. We're following that. That's the majority of the IEBC is the work area. Any addition we do cannot create, right, or extend a nonconformity in relation to accessibility, structural strength, fire safety, means of egress, or capacity of your existing mechanical, electrical, plumbing systems. You cannot increase the height or the allowable area above what's allowed by Chapter 5 of the IEBC. If the addition increases the fire area, any existing fire protection systems must be shown to comply with Chapter 9 of the IEBC. You can't just necessarily extend one. You now need to have a full analysis of that system and show that it's in compliance with current requirements. Okay, that's pretty well. There's a lot of other stuff in there. I'm just trying not to duplicate things from the prescriptive path and the work area path. Chapter 12 is the last chapter on the work area path, and it addresses historic buildings. I mentioned this earlier, that if you're following the work area path and you're dealing with a historic building, they actually require an evaluation report. And I want to highlight some of the things that are noted in this evaluation report. You have to identify each required safety feature that is in compliance. You need to know what items are not in compliance and how that might damage the contributing historic features of the building. If you're in a high seismic region, seismic design category D or above, you need to describe is there a complete load path? If there's not, where does it end? You need to demonstrate how the code intent has been complied with to provide equivalent level of safety. So we're getting into intent and not necessarily the prescriptive code language. And then we need to talk about, you need to highlight in that report any unsafe conditions, and those need to be brought to the attention of the building official. And sometimes there can be some give and take in this conversation with the building official early on. But when you're dealing with a historic building, and me as a building official, I definitely push for these evaluation reports. If it's a group R3 and it's used for an A, B, or an M, and it's less than 3,000 square feet, the code official can allow it to be a group B for evaluation purposes. And I have this picture of the Crane House Museum. You can tell it's a historic house. It's been moved like 5 times, but it's just a little museum that's there. And it's been allowed to be evaluated as a group B because it meets those provisions. Means of egress. The existing widths and heights are acceptable in the historic building if it's allowed by the code official. The main doors, if they are not required to swing in the direction of egress travel, but you need to have another door, another means to provide egress for the total occupant load for that building that will swing in the direction of egress travel. There are a lot of giveaways that they give you for historic buildings in the existing building code. Interior finishes, the stairway enclosures, when you have to have 1 hour fire resistance, glazing, stairway railings and guards, exit signs. A lot of those things are giveaways in there. Okay, so we finished we talked about repairs, and then we did the first 2 paths for compliance with the IEBC. One was prescriptive, one was work area. The last one is our performance method, and this is by far the least used and the hardest to show compliance. So I'm going to do a few slides to kind of show you how it works. It really is only when we're dealing with alterations, additions, and change of use. You cannot use this for group H, I1, I3, or I4. Deals mainly with fire and life safety issues. You can't really have any unsafe conditions. You have to make sure those are all addressed otherwise. When you're using the performance method, the building has to comply with the fire code and the property maintenance code. If you're in a flood hazard area and substantial improvement is occurring, you need to make sure you're raising it. It really does not address the structural requirements at all. And so separate from meeting the performance criteria, which I'll go over in a little bit, you need to provide a separate structural analysis showing that the building fully complies with the structural requirements of the IBC for a new building. A new building. So it has to meet all dead, live load, snow, wind, seismic, all of that. Okay, now the performance criteria. There are 3, they have to give you the structural analysis, but then there's 3 main things that you're involved with, as the architect and the design professional and responsible charge. You have to check all the fire safety features within that building, all the means of egress features, and then other general safety features. And then what they do is, so this is just an example table, and there's a ton of tables like this in Chapter 13 of the IEBC. So this is one of our fire safety features, which is separation. Do we actually have occupancy separations between them? And if you have one of these occupancies, but there are separations, then you come here and you figure out what values are you given. Okay, and there's a lot of tables that you're going to go through. In the end, you're going to fill out a summary sheet. Okay, here gives a lot of information on the building. You know, when was it built? You know, what's it built out of? Does it have smoke control, fire alarm systems, fire detection, corridor wall ratings? There's a lot you need to figure out, and you put that general information there. And then you're going to take from all those different tables. So where's that separation one we had? Is it right here? Right here. So we put all of those values here in this table, and we try to determine whether or not this building is going to comply. And we put our we put in the fire safety, the means of egress, general safety, and if it's these asterisks, that means you don't apply a score there. You sum up your scores at the bottom. Once you have those scores, this is the mandatory safety scores. Based upon my occupancy, let's say I'm a B, my fire safety has to be a 30, my means of egress has to be a 40, and my general safety has to also be a 40. It is very, very, very hard to get this to work. I don't even have, I haven't, so in the existing building code handbook that I wrote, I have an example. It walks through all the tables, how you do it, how you fill it out. And it has a table of a relatively recently constructed building and how this was all filled out. And while we were able to get a couple of the scores to meet, one of them we weren't able to meet. On top of that, you have to make sure that the full structural system is fully compliant with current code requirements. You have to verify that the fire code is being met. You have to verify the property maintenance code is being met. You have to make sure that if it's a significant improvement you're doing, that you're raising the building up above the base flood elevation if you're in a flood hazard area. There's a lot of limitations on the performance method. So I just want to make sure you're aware of that, kind of how it works. There's all these tables, you get scores, you fill them in this chart, and then you sum the scores up and make sure they're exceeding the minimum scores. Okay. Relocated structures. We actually got towards the end of this. I love this. I think I've gone too fast, so I apologize. One thing that's really tough with these virtual ones is not being able to have a lot of back and forth and commentary. And usually I have several more slides, and we actually spend a full day and we go through lots of different examples on this. But in relation to relocated structures, this is new to the, we always had that in there, but it's its own standalone chapter now. And there is a lot of new stuff that's in the building code. So now in chapter 30, there's a new section on relocatable buildings. And that section now refers you directly to the IEBC as well. And that new section of the IEBC, it tells you that all the information that you need to provide to the building official if you're going to be moving a building within there, and even if it's a modular, let's say it's a construction trailer, or let's say it's a temporary classroom at a school building. It now tells you in chapter 30 that they have to give you the manufacturer, the date it was constructed, all the design load criteria, all that stuff's there. And then it kicks you over to chapter 14 of the IEBC. So we're dealing with anytime we're relocating or moving a structure, including relocatable buildings, which the definition is in chapter 2 of the IEBC and in chapter 2 of the IEBC. And so those are buildings that were constructed with the intent of moving them throughout their lifetime. We have to also, in addition to the provisions provided in chapter 14, we have to make sure they're safe for human occupancy, as outlined in the fire code and the property maintenance code. In general, with the fire code, you're dealing with chapter 11, which is the existing building requirements. Okay, so what are the specific requirements for relocating or moving a building? It has to be located on the lot per the requirements of the IEBC or the IRC. The foundation system and the connections have to comply with the IEBC or the IRC. Wind loads have to comply with current code requirements, seismic current code requirements, snow current code requirements, flood hazard areas. If you're within them, you need to make sure they're located above the base flood elevation. Inspections, you might need to require inspections at the end to make sure that no repairs or whatnot are required. So let me give you an example. I got a call from a building official once. The jurisdiction was moving their airport. They were moving it from one location to another. There's a publicly owned airport. And the mayor of this jurisdiction had told all the owners of the hangars that they could move the hangars over without any evaluations of those buildings or anything like that. And they wouldn't have to pull a permit. And they could move them over to the new airport. So the building official was very concerned about this. One thing that we were able to at least help with is they were moving it in the same location, right? Same city, same jurisdiction. The wind loads didn't increase. The seismic loads didn't increase by more than 10%. The snow loads didn't increase by more than 5%. Because those didn't increase, they didn't really have to provide an evaluation of the building. But the building official still did, and got agreements with the mayor, require them to design the footings and foundations for the current code and how they were to anchor the building to it based on these provisions. With that caveat, just remember there are the new requirements that you have to, at least when it's a modular building or relocatable building, you have to show all that information to them. You have to show them what the design loads were, when it was constructed, who was a manufacturer, all of those provisions. And then this inspections at the end. A lot of times if we're moving a building that wasn't intended or constructed to be moved, now there could be significant damage that occurs throughout the process of moving it. And so it recommends in Chapter 14 that a structural observation be performed by the engineer of record for that new foundation system and everything, just to talk about how to evaluate the building and see if any additional repairs need to be done before they finally anchor the building and before it can be occupied. Okay, let's see. I have a question. How does the WUI code and the IEBC interface? They really don't. The WUI code is something that is adopted regionally. Most of the time it's not adopted by a state, and jurisdictions just enforce the WUI provisions within their area. And so now there's a lot of concern, right, with the fires that we've had and whatnot throughout California and things. And so I would think that the local jurisdictions, if they have it by ordinance, they've adopted the WUI code. And if you're doing alterations or additions to an existing building, I would believe that they could enforce all of the requirements of the WUI code at that time, that by you doing that, you triggered that requirement. They can now take the opportunity to make those buildings safe and have appropriate fire resistive construction and things like that implemented into the building. So the IEBC does not talk about WUI. WUI does not talk about the IEBC. But it's basically a supplemental code that is enforced regionally if they have reasons of fire risk. Another question we have is, I assume this does not apply to new modular installations. Actually, it does. So Chapter 30 of the building code does apply to new modular installations. It's a new requirement there. It's a new section. I don't remember what section in Chapter 30. Is it 30 or 30? I'm mixing. Wait, is 30 elevators? It might be 31. So there's a new section, just relocatable buildings in the IBC, and essentially that will tell you all the things you have to do for new modular construction, and at the same time, it refers you to Chapter 14 of the IEBC for these provisions. So it will apply. Okay, well, that is the end. It looks like I ended a few minutes early, so which is surprising. We went through a lot of material. Again, the intent was really to help you get a feel for what's in the IEBC. There's a lot of stuff in the IEBC. You have to know how it's laid out, where things are, how to get. There's 3 paths. There's the prescriptive, the work area method, and the performance. You have a separate chapter for repairs. You have a separate chapter for relocated or moved structures. So we have, let's see, there's a couple questions here real quick before we end. How does it compare using the IEBC in Nevada versus California with the CBC? Anything unique not accepted by California? Yes, California does adopt the CEBC, so it's the same thing, but they, as a state, they have not adopted the work area or performance methods. They only allow the prescriptive method to be used. You can still, talk to the building official. A lot of building officials will allow the work area or performance methods to be used as an alternate means and methods. But as a state, they have adopted the existing building code. It's the CEBC, and they only adopt the prescriptive path for that. And they do have a separate historic building code. Why use the performance method approach? Yeah, I don't know. It's too hard. It's too hard to get it to work. You might want to go there if you feel like you can do it really quick. If it's a new building, and you can go through the evaluations, get the values in the table, you know enough about the building that you could do it quick, then that would be a good way to go. Then you don't really have to do much as part of your change of use, or you don't have to fully comply with current code. But it's really hard. There's a lot of holes in it, and there's a lot of money being spent, just so you know, in the millions and millions of dollars of developing new performance approach. ICC has its own performance code, which is a little more involved, but it still has a lot of holes in it. So, okay, it looks like we hit all the last questions. Thank you for sticking in there. I hope you were on caffeine or something so you could stay alert and attentive, but I appreciate all of your time.